Right, so truth is often a casualty in times of war, propaganda being what it is. But in Gaza, it was never truth that fell last, it was discarded first. Crushed under the wheels of a narrative that declared war in the name of the hostages while pursuing goals that rendered those hostages expendable. As the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza deepens and international legal institutions investigate the plausibility of genocide, Israeli officials continue to mouth the language of security and rescue, even as they implement policies that ensure neither. The recent comments by Israeli Heritage Minister Amichai Eliyahu, advocating for the complete erasure of Gaza, the denial of famine, and the postponement of the rescue of Israel's own hostages still held by Hamas, have once again said the quiet part out loud. In a single sweep of incendiary rhetoric, Eliyahu confirmed what has become increasingly more and more obvious. The war on Gaza is not about rescuing their own hostages, if it ever has been, and a great many more people are doubting that day to day. It is about eliminating a people, destroying a territory, and preserving a far right government under the pretext of military necessity. Right, so Amichai Eliyahu's remarks are not aberrant outbursts, but saying the quiet part out loud again. Israel's far right ministers cannot help themselves, it seems. Israel's war in Gaza, far from prioritising the return of hostages, has consistently jeopardised their lives instead, instrumentalised their suffering, and abandoned their families. Simultaneously, the Israeli government has implemented a starvation policy of collective punishment that is killing Palestinians and Israeli hostages alike. Denials of famine by officials like Eliyahu are not ignorance, they're all part of a strategy, but not necessarily bits that Netanyahu once publicised. The campaign is now timed and arguably set to be expedited explicitly to conclude before September, when some Western nations have threatened to recognise a Palestinian state, with or without conditions from one state to another. In this light, Eliyahu has not only damaged Israel's international standing with his outburst, he's clarified its intent, and waiting until September, therefore, is, as many critics, including myself, are pointing out and warning about, leaving Israel with a window of opportunity to finish the job. From the very beginning, the Israeli government declared that its military response to the Hamas-led attack on October 7th, 2023, was about rescuing their hostages. That moral justification, the imperative to protect and retrieve Israeli civilians held captive, was elevated to near sacred status, even as evidence emerged of Israeli military involvement, of Hannibal directives being enacted, and warnings beforehand and patrols being cancelled, implying the Hamas attack was allowed to play out. Yet the reality of Israel's conduct in the weeks and months that followed exposed a stark contradiction between rhetoric and action. Offers by Hamas to release civilian hostages in exchange for halting the ground invasion of Gaza were made within days of the attack. These offers were refused. Later proposals for temporary ceasefires in return for partial hostage exchanges were similarly rejected. Instead, the Israeli military launched a devastating assault on Gaza's civilian infrastructure, resulting in the deaths of thousands and the destruction of entire neighborhoods. 10% of Gaza's population are either dead or unaccounted for right now. The suffering of the hostages Hamas took, however, rather than prompting de-escalation, was used to legitimize an expansion of the war effort instead. The families of those held captive began to notice this betrayal. Protest movements like the Hostages and Missing Families Forum gained traction, accusing Prime Minister Netanyahu of stonewalling negotiations and prioritizing political survival over lives. The forum's former spokesman, Chaim Rubenstein, publicly accused the Prime Minister of preventing hostage deals to maintain the loyalty of his far-right coalition to keep himself in power. A great many other people have said the same. Though these are allegations still, they are supported by the pattern of behaviour on show, are they not? Repeated refusals of ceasefire proposals that could have saved lives, including those of Israeli citizens. The clearest proof of the government's disregard for the hostages came from within, though, and came just the other day. The Minister of Heritage, Amichai Eliyahu, proposed that the hostages be reclassified as prisoners of war. Yeah, you might dismiss that as pure semantics. Many people refer to them as POWs online instead of hostages already. It comes up in the comments on many of my videos, actually. But this really does matter, because it suggests that the captives are now acceptable losses in the pursuit of a military victory, when that was never Israel's stated initial goal, was it? Eliyahu argued that their release should be delayed now until Hamas was defeated, reframing the hostages as a strategic obstacle rather than a humanitarian priority. These remarks sparked widespread condemnation from across Israeli society, including even President Isaac Herzog, he who claimed there are no innocents in Gaza. And opposition leaders have said as much as well. Well, Netanyahu stated that Eliyahu's comments were not policy. Actions imply otherwise. And his government stopped short of removing Eliyahu from office after all, signalling that his views, while inconveniently honest perhaps, were not outside the parameters of acceptable discourse for them. There's also the angle that Eliyahu is a member of Itamar Ben-Gvir's Otzma Yehudit party, Jewish Power, and Netanyahu, now running a minority administration, can't risk losing anybody anymore, can't risk losing any more parties, or his government is going to fall. It's how it's holding together now, I don't know, quite frankly. But Eliyahu's remarks were not limited to hostage policy either, making this even worse for Netanyahu. He also declared that Gaza was to be wiped out and that it would become entirely Jewish. Such statements can't be dismissed as fringe rhetoric. They're indicative of an ideological current within the Israeli government that seeks not merely to neutralize Hamas, but to erase Palestinian life and identity from Gaza entirely. Netanyahu is powerless to confront it while keeping himself in power is all that actually matters to him. Eliyahu's suggestion that Palestinians are educated on Mein Kampf further dehumanized an entire population, reducing them to Nazis in the eyes of the Israeli public and international observers, even as the Nazi connotations and comparisons are increasingly being aimed at Israel itself. It isn't Hamas planning to build a concentration camp in Rafah, after all, is it? This type of language is not only inflammatory, it's foundational to genocide, which is what this is. It's not war. As much as they call it a war effort, it is a genocide. It strips the enemy of their humanity. It legitimizes their suffering. It renders their annihilation desirable. Such speech should not be treated not as hyperbole, but as potential evidence of genocidal intent under international law. It should all go towards building that case, shouldn't it? Legal experts have already begun to cite statements by Israeli officials, including Eliyahu, in ongoing cases before the International Court of Justice. The ICJ's interim ruling last year acknowledged that Israel's actions in Gaza could plausibly amount to genocide, and these latest comments may soon form part of that evidentiary record as well. Meanwhile, conditions in Gaza continue, of course, to deteriorate into further famine. According to the Washington Post and Al Jazeera, amongst other sources, over 147 people have died from malnutrition, including 88 children, and that's on top of those dying at the so-called aid hubs. Israel's decision to block land crossings and severely limit humanitarian aid has been directly linked to these deaths as well. This starvation policy has not only devastated the Palestinian population, it has also endangered Israeli hostages. Just this week, as covered by El Pais and Quds News, Hamas released footage of Israeli captives who were visibly emaciated too, stating that they were receiving the same food, or lack thereof, as their Palestinian captors. If there is no food, there's none for captive or captor, is there? This video confirmed that Israel's starvation blockade is not only a war crime against Palestinians, but a betrayal of its own citizens as well. Certainly, Zionists will claim while there is no starvation in Gaza, Hamas are clearly starving their people. That is Eliyahu's position, that there is no starvation. Yet he also wants to leave the hostages there and reclassify them as POWs. So how can both positions be justified, even if they were true? We've seen enough images of starvation coming from Gaza to know everyone there will be starving. Even a Burke like Donald Trump has acknowledged this. Palestinian and Israeli alike, therefore, is the logical conclusion. These starvation tactics echo historical precedents from the Biafran blockade to the siege of Sarajevo, where food was weaponized as a means of forcing submission. International humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention, prohibits starvation as a method of warfare, yet Israel's policy has functioned exactly in this way. Aid drops have been assented to, but this is negligible in terms of quantity, and land convoys have been blocked for weeks. Doctors Without Borders and other medical NGOs have documented catastrophic rates of malnutrition amongst children, all whilst the Israeli government insists no famine exists. Denial has become not just a political posture, but a strategic tool. The Israeli public's response to this evidence has been disturbingly muted, though. A Quds News Network poll conducted in the same month found that 47% of Israelis do not believe famine is occurring in Gaza, despite overwhelming international evidence. This denial is not accidental, it's the result of deliberate state propaganda, reinforced by statements from figures like Eliyahu. Denial is not just a moral failure, it's a stage in the genocidal process. By refusing to acknowledge the suffering of the population under siege, Israel not only escapes accountability, but also prepares its citizens to accept further atrocities. The media ecosystem in Israel plays a crucial role in this process. Government-aligned outlets routinely frame famine reports as Hamas propaganda, while downplaying or ignoring footage of starving civilians and hostages. The result is a cultivated ignorance, one that insulates the public from the horror being carried out in its name. This campaign of denial and destruction is also politically timed. Multiple Western governments, including the UK, France, and Canada, have signalled their intention to recognise a Palestinian state at the UN General Assembly in September, contingent on a ceasefire and humanitarian relief. Eliyahu's comment that the government is racing ahead to wipe out Gaza before this recognition can occur reveals the strategic calculus behind Israel's escalation. The aim is to alter the demographics and political realities on the ground before international diplomacy can impose constraints. So in this context, the starvation, the displacement, the erasure of Gaza are not collateral damage, they're the objectives. Recognition delayed is impunity enabled. By stalling until September, Western powers have effectively given Israel a deadline by which to finish the job: the destruction of Gaza's civilian infrastructure, the displacement of over 2 million people, the obliteration of entire neighborhoods suggests a strategy of permanent depopulation. If Palestinian statehood is declared after this has been achieved, it'll be a hollow gesture, a state with no land, no people, and no future. So against this backdrop, domestic opposition in Israel has grown louder and more organised. Weekly protests continue in Tel Aviv, where hostage families and their supporters demand a ceasefire and a renewed focus on negotiations. Movements such as We Are All Hostages and Kaplan Force have mobilised thousands, rejecting the government's claim that war is the only path to safety. Former hostages and their families have accused the state of abandoning them, not out of necessity, but out of political convenience. These voices are growing, but they remain marginalised by a government intent on pursuing its campaign of devastation. Protesters have erected camps near military bases, blocked roads, launched hunger strikes. They have stormed Knesset meetings, they've petitioned international bodies, yet they are met not with empathy, but with indifference or repression. The Israeli media largely sidelines their stories, while far-right commentators accuse them of undermining national unity. The state has effectively turned the families of the hostages into enemies of the state, not for what they believe, but for daring to question the government's priorities. The international community too has a role to play, not just as observers, but as enablers. By delaying recognition of Palestinian statehood until September, Western states have given Israel a window to finish its military objectives. Conditional diplomacy, which waits for appropriate timing, functions as complicity when it enables ethnic cleansing and famine. If the world does not act before September, it may find that by the time it extends diplomatic recognition, there will be no Palestinians left in Gaza to receive it. International law is clear. States have a duty not only to refrain from genocide, but to prevent it. The Genocide Convention imposes obligations on all signatories, including the US and EU members, to act when credible evidence emerges. That evidence is now abundant. By failing to act, these states risk becoming accessories after the fact. Amichai Eliyahu has not, despite claims to the contrary, undermined Israeli policy, therefore, he simply explained it. His rhetoric, far from being a liability, is a translation of policy into words. The horror of this genocide is not just in the bombs or the starvation, but in the calculated coldness with which it is being justified. The hostages were never the goal. They were the excuse. Their suffering was the alibi for a campaign of annihilation. Their deaths, whether by bomb or by starvation, are not failures of policy. They're the outcomes of intent. So the world now faces a choice here. To treat Eliyahu's comments as aberrations is to absolve the state that tolerates them. To ignore the starvation of hostages is to concede that some lives are expendable. To wait until September is to collaborate in the final act of this tragedy for Palestine and Palestinian people in Gaza. Eliyahu has said the quiet part out loud. It's time the rest of us started listening and heeding the warning, therefore. Some, of course, are already listening to this, and one of the most notable has been Slovenia, who have become the first EU nation to enact a full arms embargo on Israel. No imports, no exports, and most crucially of all for a state whose embargo Israel has jeered, no transit from other states through their territory either. Therein lies the problem for Israel, as logistics become the bigger issue here, and a much more bigger global nightmare for them. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.